There is a boulder in the high desert of northern Arizona with a small figure cut into its face, a bear's paw, 4 claws and a pad, scratched into red sandstone and darkened by centuries of sun until the cut lines are almost the same color as the rock around them. For most of the people who ever walked past that boulder, the mark meant nothing at all. A scratch on a stone in empty country. Travelers passed it, herders passed it. Later the men who drew the maps of this region passed it, and not one of them could tell you what the figure was, or who made it, or why anyone would climb out into that heat to cut a paw into a rock. But a Hopi man standing at the same boulder would not see a scratch. He would read a word. He would tell you that the paw is the sign of the Bear Clan, that a young man cut it there with a harder stone on the hardest journey of his life, and that the same boulder and the ones around it carry more than 5,000 marks just like it. Each one a clan, each one a family. Each one a person who walked past and left proof that he had come this way. The marks were never a mystery, they were only unreadable to the people holding the maps. And near the turn of the 20th century, 2 outsiders sat down with Hopi men who could read these marks, and started writing down how. One was an archaeologist from the Smithsonian named Jesse Walter Fuches. The other was a missionary named Henry Voth, who had spent the better part of 10 years living among the Hopi and learning to speak their language. What they wrote down is still in print, in old government reports and museum volumes almost no one opens. So we opened them, and what the marks in the desert record turns out to be far stranger and far more human than any mystery a mapmaker ever imagined. Let's start with the rock itself, because the Hopi have a name for it, and the name tells you exactly what it is. They call it Tutuveni. In English, that comes out closest to newspaper rock. Not newspaper the way we would mean a mystery or a headline, newspaper the way you would mean a record, a running account, page after page of who was here. Tutuveni sits near Willow Springs, out toward the Echo Cliffs in the open country south of Tuba City. It is not one carved stone. It is a scatter of sandstone boulders across an area a little larger than a city block, and the marks concentrate on a cluster of about 8 of them. One boulder alone, the largest at the site, carries close to 60% of everything cut there. And what is cut there is not art in the way we usually mean the word, and it is not decoration, and it is not a puzzle waiting for a clever outsider to crack. It is signatures. More than 5,000 Hopi clan symbols, and by the best reading of the rock itself, the oldest of them go back something like 800 years, to around the year 1200, with newer ones added on top and beside them all the way into living memory. Think about what that means for a second, because it is easy to say 5,000 and move on. This is the largest single gathering of Hopi clan symbols anywhere. One boulder field in the desert holding 8 centuries of a people signing their names in the same place, over and over, generation after generation, in the same handful of symbols their grandparents used. There is nothing else quite like it in the American Southwest. And for most of the time outsiders have been in this country, they walked right past it, because you cannot read a page in a language you were never taught. The site is still out there, and it has not had an easy century. The marks that took 800 years to accumulate started disappearing fast once the roads came through. Most of the damage to Tutuveni happened in a single stretch between about 1980 and 2005, when people who had no idea what they were looking at scratched their own initials over clan symbols older than any country on this continent, and up to 1/10 of the marks have been harmed. In 2010, a power company paid for a fence to go around the site to slow that down, and a team of specialists worked with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office to record the boulders in 3 dimensions, digitally, so that even the marks that get chipped away are not lost completely. That last detail is worth holding on to, because it repeats, in a modern form, exactly what Fuches and Voth did more than a century ago. Outsiders with cameras and scanners, working alongside the Hopi, trying to save a record the Hopi never needed saved, because they had never forgotten how to read it. The outside world has slowly come around to what the place is. Tutuveni is now recognized as a traditional cultural property, protected under the kind of heritage rules usually reserved for famous landmarks, and it has been put forward for recognition among the great monuments of the world. It took a strange path to get there, a spot that was, to the people who made it, simply the page where you signed your name on the way to the salt, is now studied and fenced and mapped by institutions, precisely because those institutions finally grasped how much history a single boulder field can hold. The Hopi knew what it was all along, long before anyone thought to fence it. So how do you read it? That is the part that took me the longest to understand, and it is the part that makes the whole thing click into place. A Hopi clan symbol is not a picture of a thing, it is closer to a name. The Hopi are organized into clans, and each clan carries a sign. There is a bear clan, and its mark is tied to the bear and the bear's paw. There is a snake clan, there is a reed clan, and a sand clan, and a badger clan, and a tobacco clan, and a water clan, sometimes called the cloud clan or the rain clan, whose sign is tied to water and rain. When a man from the bear clan cut his mark into the boulder at Tutuveni, he was not drawing a bear because he liked bears. He was writing the equivalent of his family name. He was saying, "The bear people were here, and I am one of them, and I made the journey." And the bear was only one family among many. When Fuches sat with the clan chiefs and asked them to name the clans, the lists ran long. The snake and the bear and the badger, the reed clan and the firewood clan, the horn and the flute who traveled together, the eagle, the rabbit, the tobacco, the sand, the lizard, and the water people, with their clouds and their rain. Dozens of family lines, each with its own sign, each sign as fixed and recognizable as a brand burned into hide. So when a Hopi elder looks at the crowded face of that boulder, he is not looking at a jumble of scratches. He is reading a roll call. This clan came through here, and that one, and that one. Across 800 years, the whole community written out one young man at a time. It is a census in stone, and every household in it is still legible to the people who kept the list. And here is where I have to be careful, because this is the seam that runs through the whole story, and the honest thing is to keep the two sides of it apart. On one side there is the record you can measure. The rock is real, and so are the marks. You can count them and photograph them. You can study how weathered each cut is and work out a rough order of which came first. Archaeologists have done exactly that. On the other side there is the reading. What each mark actually means. Which clan the bear stands for. Why the young man was out there at all. What the journey was for. That does not come out of the rock. That comes out of Hopi tradition, carried by Hopi people, and no amount of measuring the stone will ever give it to you. The map makers had the first side. They could see the marks perfectly well. What they were missing was the second side, and the second side is the only one that turns a scratch into a word. Every time I tell you what a mark means in this video, that meaning comes from the Hopi, through the men who wrote it down. Everything I tell you about the stone itself comes from the stone. Keep those two apart in your head, and you will never be fooled by this story. Here is what the reading looks like in practice. Say the same simple sign shows up again and again across one boulder, in cuts of clearly different ages, some crisp and sharp, some almost worn smooth. To an outsider that is just repetition, maybe even one person practicing the same doodle. To a Hopi reader, it is a line of different men of the same clan, spread across as many generations, each one recording that he too made the journey. The sign does not change, because the clan does not change. That is the entire point of a clan symbol. It is built to stay legible for centuries, so that a great-grandson can cut the same mark his great-grandfather cut and be understood without a single word passing between them. Written language pulls off that same trick with letters, and the Hopi pulled it off with clan signs, generation after generation. So why were these young men out there at all? Why cut your family's name into a rock out in open country? And the answer is, a journey, one of the hardest and most sacred the Hopi made, and Tutuveni sits directly on the road to it. The Hopi call the Grand Canyon Ongtupka. It means, roughly, the Salt Canyon, and it is not just scenery to them and never has been. Down at the bottom, near where the Little Colorado River meets the Colorado, there are salt deposits, and gathering that salt was a sacred act, not a chore. The trail down to it is the Hopi Salt Trail. It runs from the Hopi mesas out past the country around Tuba City, down through a side canyon to the Little Colorado, and along the gorge to the confluence and the salt beyond. Along the way there is a chain of shrines, real stopping places, where prayers were made, one after another, all the way to the canyon floor. And Willow Springs, where Tutuveni stands, was one of the camps on the way. And it was a long, punishing way. The salt lay at the bottom of the deepest canyon in the whole region, down where the Little Colorado runs into the Colorado, and reaching it meant days on foot, across open desert, and then a hard climb down into the gorge, and a harder one back out, loaded. This was not a run to a store. The salt itself was holy, gathered with prayer and offerings at places fixed by generations of use. And the men who went carried the responsibility of doing it right, for everyone back home who was not there. The chain of shrines along the trail was the proof of that. Each one was a station where the travelers stopped to pray before going on, so that the whole route, from the mesas to the canyon floor, was itself a kind of ceremony, stretched out across 100 miles of country. Tutuveni was the place on that ceremony where a man left his name. But this was not a walk anyone could take on a whim. The salt journey was tied to becoming a man. Among the Hopi, a boy was initiated into the men's societies through a ceremony called Wuwutsim, and the salt pilgrimage came as part of that passage into adulthood. A young man who had been through the ceremony would set out toward Ongtupka, and on the way, at Tutuveni, he would stop and camp and pray, and he would cut his clan's mark into the rock. That was the point of the mark. It was a record that he had done it. That the bear people, or the snake people, or the water people, had sent another young man down the sacred trail, the way they always had. Do that for 4 or 5 centuries, one initiation at a time, and you get 5,000 names on 8 boulders. The salt pilgrimages grew rare as the 20th century went on, but the newest marks on the rock reach almost to living memory, and the oldest reach back 800 years, and every single one of them was cut by a Hopi hand for a Hopi reason. That is worth sitting with, because it turns the whole idea of a mystery inside out. A mapmaker sees a boulder covered in strange marks in empty desert and has no idea what he is looking at. But there was never anything unknown about it to the people who made it. Every mark had an author. Every author had a clan. Every clan had a reason. The knowledge did not vanish. It simply lived with the Hopi, and not with the men drawing the maps. And that is the thing the mapmakers never had a way around. There was no key carved beside the marks, no line of translation, nothing an outsider could crack with enough patience, because the meaning was never stored in the rock in the first place. It lived in the initiation. A man learned what the symbols meant by becoming the kind of person who was allowed to make them, inside a clan and a society, over years of his life. You could copy every mark at Tutuveni into a notebook, and some people did, and still walk away holding nothing but shapes, because the reading was never in the shapes. It was in the people. That is why a trained scholar could stand at that boulder for a full afternoon and leave knowing less about it than a Hopi child already did. Which brings us to the man who wrote a lot of it down, because his name matters here, and the date matters more. In the 1890s and around the year 1900, Fuches was working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, the research arm of the Smithsonian that studied Native American peoples. Fuches spent years around the Hopi mesas. He excavated an old Hopi village called Sikyatki near First Mesa. He made some of the earliest sound recordings of Hopi songs, singing them into a wax cylinder machine so they would not be lost. And in 1900, he published a long report with a dry title, Tusayan Migration Traditions, in the annual report of the Bureau. Tusayan was an old name for the Hopi country. Migration traditions meant the stories the clans told about where they came from. Now, the reason that report is worth trusting is not that Fuches was clever, and it is not that he was some perfect friend to the Hopi, because the relationship between the Hopi and the outsiders who came to study them was tangled and often unfair. The reason it is worth trusting is narrower and simpler. On this subject, the migrations and the clan symbols, Fuches did not make things up. He wrote down, as carefully as he could, what Hopi men told him, and he said so plainly, and he named them. In the report he lists them. He writes that while he was collecting the migration legends of the different clans, he consulted the clan chiefs whenever he could. 3 men named Wiki, Wikiatiwa, and Kopeli gave him the legends of the snake clans. A man named Anawita gave him the story of the Rain clan, the water people. A man named Hani gave him the tobacco legends. Another gave him the horn and flute story, another the eagle. These were not anonymous sources. Fuches named them because the knowledge was theirs, not his. He was the stenographer. They were the record. And 120 years later, when so much has been lost or muddled, those names are the reason we can stand on any of this. It is hard now to overstate how easy it was, in that era, to throw these stories away. To a lot of scholars at the time, a migration legend was just a myth, A nice tale with no more real history in it than a fable, and certainly nothing you would ever use to go find an actual village. The idea that you could take an old man's account of his clan's wanderings, walk it out onto a map, and hit real ruins struck many educated people as faintly ridiculous. And yet that is exactly what kept happening. The traditions Fuches was writing down were not vague poetry, they were specific. They named places, and directions, and an order of events, and when they got checked against the ground, they held up often enough that the ground itself started to look like the more reliable witness. Fuches was recording a kind of history that his own profession was only just learning to take seriously. Because here is what the record says, and it is the piece that turns a field of marks into a map of a whole people's history. The clans whose symbols cover that boulder did not all come from the same place. The Hopi are not one stream. They are many streams that ran together. According to the traditions Fuches collected, the clans arrived in the Hopi country from 3 main directions and settled, one group after another, at the village of Walpi on its high mesa. Some came from the north, from a place the traditions call Toconabi. Some came from the east, from the pueblos out toward New Mexico, a region the traditions call Muyobi. And some came from the south, up along the Little Colorado River, from a region the traditions call Palatquabi. The marks on the rock are the signatures. The migration traditions are the story of how all those different signatures ended up carved into the same stone. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let me take the northern stream first, because it carries the most famous clan of all, and because it shows how a clan tradition and a public ceremony can hold the same memory. The traditions say that some of the oldest Hopi clans came down from the north, from Toconabi, in the canyon country up toward the San Juan River. Among them was the Snake Clan, and the Snake Clan is not some obscure footnote. Its ceremony, the Snake Dance, became the single best-known Hopi ritual to the outside world, the one that drew crowds of tourists and photographers to the mesas by the early 1900s. Fuches studied it closely, and he noticed something in it that reads like a fingerprint of the migrations. When Fuches looked at who actually performs the snake ceremony and what objects it uses, he found the marks of more than one clan tangled together in it. The ceremonial pieces carried signs of the puma, the horn, and the snake. And that lined up exactly with the legend, which said that in ancient times those groups had lived together before they ever reached the mesas. In other words, the ceremony was carrying the same history as the migration story, folded into its objects and its songs. 2 independent records, the spoken legend and the living ritual, pointing back to the same shared past. That is the kind of quiet confirmation that is very hard to fake and very easy to miss, and it is exactly the sort of thing Fuches was good at catching. The eastern clans came in from the other side, from the Pueblo country over toward New Mexico, the region the traditions call Muyobi, and they arrived later than the northern groups, folding into villages that were already standing. And some of this can be pinned to a real date, which is rare and precious for anything this old. There was a Hopi village called Awatobi that was destroyed in the year 1700, in an event the Hopi remember to this day, and Fuches could reason from which clans had lived there that certain migrations must have happened before that year. Think about what that gives you. A floating body of legend suddenly gets a hard edge, a fixed point in real time, because a clan that was present at a village we can date had to have arrived before the village fell. The traditions were not drifting somewhere in a timeless past. They were tied, at least at the edges, to the calendar. Now let me follow the southern stream, because it is the clearest of the 3, and because it ties the marks on that rock directly to a real place you can still stand in today. The southern clans, the water people and the ones who traveled with them, told Fuches that their old home was far to the south, in that region called Palatquabi, and they told him why they left. The legends say that their ancestors were driven out of their ancient home by great floods caused by Palulukan, the great water serpent, a mighty being in Hopi belief tied to water and to the underworld. Whatever memory lies behind that image, the tradition is specific and consistent. The water rose, the old home became impossible, and the water clans moved north. There is something almost too fitting about which clan this was. The water people carry the sign of clouds and rain. Their whole standing in Hopi life is bound up with bringing water to a country that never has enough of it, and their oldest memory is of having far too much. A home in the south drowned by flood, by the great water serpent himself, until they had no choice but to leave. So the clan whose gift is rain was once driven out by water, and carried that memory north across some of the driest ground in the region, all the way to a mesa where rain is the whole difference between a harvest and a hungry winter. Whatever really happened in the deep past to plant that story, you can feel why a people would hold on to it and never let it go. The Water Clan's identity runs on a single thread, from the flood that expelled them to the clouds they still pray for. And they did not move in one jump. Fuches wrote down the route the way the Water Clan chief described it, village by village, like directions. From the oldest of their southern homes they moved on in turn to one ruined village, then another, working their way up the country. One of those stops was a place near present-day Winslow, Arizona, that Fuches spelled Homolobi. Another was a small stone village only about 4 miles from Walpi, called Paketomo. And then, at last, Walpi itself, up on its mesa, where the water people finally settled among the clans already there. Here is the line in Fuches's report that stopped me cold when I read it, because it is the seam made plain in one sentence. After he lays out the migration route, the string of ruined villages the Water Clans say they lived in on the way north, he writes that the last 4 of those ruins have been identified, and that extensive archaeological investigations have been conducted at them. Read that again. The Hopi told him a story. A clan tradition about floods and a serpent and a long walk north through a chain of villages. And when the archaeologists went looking, the villages were there. Real ruins, in the ground, in the places the tradition said they would be. Now, I want to be careful and not say more than the record says, because that is the whole discipline of this. The serpent is not an archaeological finding. Nobody dug up a great snake, but the trail of villages is real, and it is where the tradition put it. The story and the ground line up at the points where they can actually be checked, and that is a remarkable thing to be able to say about an oral tradition that outsiders once waved off as pure legend. The man who gave Fuches that route has a name, and I do not want to let it slide past, because he is the living center of this whole story. His name was Anawita. He was the chief of the Patki, the Water Clan, and Fuches describes him in the report, in plain words, as a very reliable man. Anawita is the one who told Fuches where the water people came from and how they traveled, stop by stop, and Fuches adds one detail about him that tells you exactly who actually held this knowledge. Some of the oldest villages on the migration route had not yet been found by archaeologists when Fuches was writing. They were, as far as the outside world was concerned, lost. And Fuches says, in as many words, that Anawita could point them out. That this Hopi man could take any archaeologist who had the means to go looking and show him the sites of the ancient villages that the whole apparatus of science had not managed to locate. Sit with that for a moment, because it turns the usual picture upside down. We tend to imagine the scientist as the one who knows, and the native informant as the one who gets studied. Here it is the reverse. The archaeologist with all his training did not know where the oldest villages were. The Hopi chief did. The knowledge that could have guided an entire excavation was not sitting in a university or a museum. It was in Anawita, carried in a clan tradition, as precise as a set of directions to a house across town. The marks were readable. The migration was mapped. The lost villages were locatable. And all of it lived in Hopi men who were standing right there the whole time, waiting for somebody to think to ask. And one of those villages on the route, the one Fuches spelled Homolobi, you can walk into right now. Today it is spelled Homolovi, and it sits in a wide floodplain of the Little Colorado River, a few miles northeast of Winslow, Arizona. The name is Hopi. Homolovi means, roughly, the place of the little hills, and it was the old Hopi name for that whole stretch of country long before Winslow had a name. It was not one village, but a cluster of them, strung out for miles along the river. People lived there in the stretch of time between roughly 1260 and 1400, farming the floodplain where the Little Colorado spread out and dropped its silt, growing corn and cotton, firing pottery that still turns up in the ground there by the thousands of pieces. And then, over a couple of generations, they left and moved on toward the mesas where the Hopi live today. To an archaeologist, Homolovi is an ancestral Hopi settlement on the Little Colorado. To the Hopi, it is exactly what the tradition Anawita carried says it is, a home their clans lived in on the long road north. The same road cut, symbol by symbol, into the boulder at Tutuveni. And Homolovi was not a single village but a whole run of them, spread along something like 19 miles of the Little Colorado, hundreds and hundreds of rooms in all, lived in at different times as families came and went along the river. Archaeologists have spent decades digging into those villages, and the story the ground tells fits the shape of the tradition. People gathered here in large numbers for a stretch, farmed the floodplain hard, made and traded a great deal of pottery, and then, toward the end of the 1300s and into the 1400s, drew together and moved up onto the Hopi mesas, where their descendants live now. The clans did not disappear from Homolovi. They walked north, exactly the way the water people told Fuches they had, and they carried the memory of the place with them, which is the whole reason the Hopi can still stand there today and tell you that it is theirs. The state of Arizona made those villages into a park, and the story of the park's name is the story of this whole video in miniature. For years it was called Homolovi Ruins State Park, Ruins. And the Hopi asked the state to change it, because from inside Hopi tradition those villages are not ruins at all. They are not dead. The ancestors are still present there. The places are, in the Hopi understanding, spiritually alive. And in the spring of 2011 the Arizona State Parks Board agreed, and voted to drop the word ruins from the name, and to add a line describing the site as ancestral Hopi villages. It is now simply Homolovi State Park. A small thing, a word on a sign, but it is the whole difference between a story that ended and a story that is still being told by the people who own it. These are living people. The clans on the rock still exist. The word had to change because the thing it described never actually died. Now I want to come back to the seam one more time and set it down as plainly as I can, because this is a place where it is very easy to reach for the wrong kind of answer, and the wrong kind of answer is everywhere. When people hear about strange marks on a rock that outsiders could not read, marks that are centuries old and cover a boulder in the middle of nowhere, some of them go looking for a secret, a hidden meaning, visitors from somewhere else, star maps left by someone who was not human. And I understand the pull of that, because a mystery is exciting, and a secret feels like a gift. But it is worth saying, clearly and with respect, that there is no mystery of that kind here, and the true answer is stronger than the invented one. The marks at Tutuveni were made by Hopi hands, every single one of them. They are the clan signatures of Hopi men who walked the salt trail toward the Grand Canyon as part of becoming adults in their own society. We know this not because we guessed, but because the Hopi say so, and because the men who cut the marks belong to clans that still exist, using symbols that are still understood by the people who own them. To look at a Hopi man's record of his own sacred journey and imagine it was left by someone from the stars is not the bigger, more wonderful idea it pretends to be. If anything, it is a smaller one, because it takes a real people with a real history and a real achievement and hands all of it to a stranger who was never there. The truth is better. The truth is that human beings, on foot, in a hard and dry country, kept a written record in stone for 8 centuries, in a script of clan symbols they never once stopped being able to read. So why did the maps never explain it? That was the promise at the start, and now the answer is simple, and it is not a cover-up, and it never was. The marks were always explainable. They explained themselves, completely, to anyone who belonged to the tradition that made them. The reason the mapmakers left them blank is the plainest reason there is. They could see the marks, and they could not read the language, and instead of finding someone who could, they mostly wrote the marks off as curiosities and wrote on. The knowledge was never lost, it was just never theirs. It sat with the Hopi the whole time, in the clans, in the chiefs, in men like Anawita who could have drawn the map any afternoon if anyone had thought to ask. What Fuches did, and what Voth did in his own way, was finally to ask, and to write the answers down. Voth spoke Hopi, and from the village of Oribe he wrote down traditions by the 100, more than 100 of them, and published them for a museum in Chicago in 1905. Between the two men there is a whole library of this material, sitting in old bound volumes, most of it unread for a lifetime. It is not lost. It never was. It is only quiet, and it is only honest to say that even this was a complicated thing, and not a clean rescue. Voth was a missionary, and he recorded a great deal that the Hopi considered private, and to this day there are Hopi who feel that too much left the mesas and was printed for strangers to read. That tension is real, and it does not go away. But the particular corner of it that we followed tonight, the migration traditions and the clan symbols, Fuches got the way you are supposed to get it. He sat with the people whose knowledge it was. He named them. He wrote down what they chose to tell him. Wiki. Wikyatiwa, Kopeli, Hani, Anawita. Those names are in a government report from more than a century ago because the men who carried the story earned their place in it. And the record they left, between the boulder and the book, is still there for anyone willing to learn how to read it. Go out to Willow Springs and the marks are on the stone, 5,000 of them. A little worn, a little damaged by people who came later and did not care. But there. Open Fuches's old report, and the route is there, village by village, north from the flooded south to the mesas. Stand in Homolovi, and the ancestral village is there, in the floodplain, not a ruin, alive. 3 pieces of the same record. The mark, the memory, and the ground. And the only reason it ever looked like a mystery is that for a long time the people holding the maps were not the people holding the story. Before we close, if these old stories and the people who first wrote them down are what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. So the next time you hear about marks in the desert that nobody could explain, remember the bear's paw on the boulder. And remember that somebody always could.